And welcome to the briefing room on this Monday. I'm Devin Dwyer, joined by our Deputy Political Director, Mary Alice Parks. Great to have you with us. Hope you had a good weekend. We launch off into the tail end of December. Can't believe we can already say that.
Is that true?
With a huge list of things to do for this Congress before they get out of town for the holiday. The list is growing. Take a look here. Just in the next 9 days, our Congress needs to fund the government to avoid a shutdown. They need to deal with the situation over the southern border wall that the president has been demanding. There's a lot of talk afoot right now over punishing Saudi Arabia for the killing of Jamal Khashoggi. There's talk of finalizing the farm bill, which of course is critical for food stamps in this country and farm subsidies. There's talk about protecting Robert Mueller. And other parts of the list, they need to extend the flood insurance program. They need to deal with a sexual harassment policy on Capitol Hill. And they're talking about, yes, dealing with wildfire relief from that epic wildfire season, Mary Alice. I think we talk about this a lot with Congress. This has been one of the least productive Congresses in some time. But there's a whole bunch of impactful stuff that needs to be done in just 9 days.
What's amazing is that this week, when we are coming just days after this incredible flood of very partisan news, talk about whether the president and his former associates are in great legal and political peril. This week, looking at that list, Congress needs a whole bunch of bipartisan work. And it's interesting, every single one of those bullet points includes some bipartisan support. We've seen members on either side, pretty far stretches of the wings of the two parties, come together in agreement over, for instance, something to do with Saudi Arabia that was listed, or wildfire relief, the farm bill. So we could end up seeing both parties work together very closely this week, and that will be very jarring with this sort of whole other strand of the news and the headlines that we've been dealing with in the White House.
But it is the last hurrah for Republicans controlling both chambers of Congress, and there's only so much time left on the clock before these guys want to get out of town for the holidays. Let's bring in our senior congressional correspondent, Mary Bruce, who is in the thick of it all right now. The sprint to the finish. Mary, let's start with the big elephant in the room. We've talked about it here in the briefing room for the past few weeks, but it's this dispute over what to do about the president's border wall. Yesterday on the Sunday shows, we heard Lindsey Graham, Senator of South Carolina, basically appeal to the president to dig in, not give up on his number, $5 billion. Are you seeing any movement that Democrats are willing to play ball?
It is real hard to see how the president is going to get that $5 billion number that he is looking for. And while you see many Republicans like Lindsey Graham and others coming out and pushing for that, hoping that Republicans can finally help the president fulfill that promise to his supporters to build the wall, it is hard to see, though, Democrats wanting to give any wiggle room here to the president on this. Remember what's on the table here. Democrats previously have agreed to $1.6 billion. That, of course, is a far cry from what the president is asking for. And that funding would largely go to boosted border security, talking about more manpower, drones, more technology on the border, more fencing. But that is not the brick and mortar wall that the president has promised his supporters. And the president doesn't necessarily have as much leverage here as he's had in previous fights over funding. And of course, remember that clock is ticking. They need to get this done before the 21st. That's the new deadline that they have to fund the government. And after that, Democrats are in charge here in the House. It will become increasingly more difficult for the president to get any kind of wall funding. But right now, both sides are digging in, not just Republicans, but Democrats too. And it's hard to see where they will be able to compromise and on what number.
And all of this is going to come to a head, Mary, tomorrow at this time, just before we come on the air tomorrow. Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, the top two Democrats in Congress, will go to the White House for a one-on-one meeting with President Trump. What are you hearing from both of those offices as to how they plan to go into this meeting? You talk about leverage, the president not having as much as he once did, perhaps. Do you get the sense that Democrats are looking to drive a hard bargain?
I think a hard bargain indeed, and it will be very interesting to see how they play this meeting. Remember, the president has previously, sort of turned away from his own party to side with Chuck and Nancy, as he calls them. They have had success, the Democratic leaders, in the past at huddling with the president, making personal appeals to him to get him to kind of move to their side of debates. We've seen that in the past. Whether we will see any of that tomorrow remains to be seen. But, Democrats are going to have to try to explain to the president how he can sell whatever deal they ultimately get to his supporters, how he can try and get Republicans on board with what I assume is what Democrats want to be a lower number than what Republicans and the president originally have said they want. A lot of this comes down to not just, finding a compromise, but how to spin this, right? How both sides can come out claiming they have a win. So we will be looking very closely to see how the president sits down with both leaders here. And remember, this is going to be the first of what I suspect will be many meetings like this, as the president is going to have to likely find some kind of way to work with the Democrats if he wants to get anything done on any items on his agenda over the next 2 years.
And Mary Alice, you've been following the politics on some of these other items on the list that really will impact a lot of Americans' lives. The Farm Bill, for example, wildfire funding and support, the flood insurance program. What's your sense, talking to Democrats and Republicans, bipartisan support for all of these measures, that we can actually get some of these items across the line before the end of the year?
It's amazing that Democrats took control of the House for the new year, and yet when you talk to them on Capitol Hill, they are eager to work across the aisle. They are quick to say that they want to be able to show the American people that they can govern, they can pass legislation, and they can work with Republicans and even work with this White House to deliver and to govern. I think that Mary was exactly right that the president probably is the one with the least amount of leverage in this negotiation, and so Democrats could take advantage of that, but we're really not seeing that thrust. Largely, I'm seeing Democrats say they want to just get things done and pass some bills.
It's going to be really interesting. The sexual harassment policy, which is on the table after the Me Too movement of the past year. Congress looking to make lawmakers pay their own settlements if they come to any sexual harassment settlements, extend the policy, those protections of sexual harassment to interns in Capitol Hill offices, really modernize that policy. That's one of the things that's on the table. And of course, the other big legislative bill that is on the table right now is this criminal justice reform measure that would limit sentences, reduce those mandatory sentences for low-level drug offenders, perhaps free several thousand already behind bars right now, make the prison recidivism rate lower. Mary Alice, this is something that has won the support from the Koch brothers, all the way to liberal Democrats.
Absolutely.
Really interesting.
It's so interesting that you have the White House, Jared Kushner, and the president supporting this legislation.
Yeah, we have the president's tweet, too. Take a look here.
Pushing it and working alongside Democrats to try to get this some movement and some traction on Capitol Hill. The biggest roadblock so far seems to be Mitch McConnell, and you see there the president saying, go for it, Mitch, encouraging the Republican Senate leader to take up this bill.
And Jordan Phelps has been leading our reporting on that. I want to bring her into this conversation right now. Jordan, give us the latest. I know you've been working the phones this morning on this criminal justice reform measure, sort of its last gasp. I think a lot of people are surprised that the president is backing this. The Kochs are backing it, Democrats are backing it, and yet you hear Mitch McConnell say, I don't know if we can get to it. What's actually going on here?
Yeah, Devin, I hear from supporters inside and outside the White House that they are frustrated with what they feel is a mishandling of this bill by the Senate leadership. Not only Mitch McConnell, but I'm also hearing frustrations regarding Senator Cornyn that they have not been really straightforward with making this whip count happen and have really moved the goalposts, previously saying that they just needed to demonstrate that there were 60 votes for this, now saying they want more consensus within the Republican conference. But Devin, this bill is not dead yet. There is another chance. Senator Ted Cruz came out crucially in support of this bill last week. He had been a holdout, and there is some updated language that Republicans are set to all take a look at tomorrow, and supporters tell me they're hopeful there could be a new whip count after tomorrow's conference lunch.
All right, so tomorrow, a lot riding on tomorrow, both for the funding measure and for some of these other items on the to-do list. Okay, Jordan and Mary Bruce, stand by. Mary Alice, the other big story that's driving the conversation today is the chief of staff at the White House. The big shakeup over the weekend, President Trump saying John Kelly is on the way out. We thought we had a replacement, Nick Ayers, the vice president's chief of staff, but it looks like we're back to the drawing board.
I think the president thought that he had a replacement
Right.
too. That was what was so interesting today. It seemed as though the White House was waking up totally flat-footed unsure who was going to be the replacement. You know, it's obviously DC water cooler type talk. I'm not sure how much it will resonate outside of the Beltway, except that it does create more and more of these headlines that the White House is often plagued with, just about general chaos, unorganization, dysfunction, and the president can't like those. They are continuing at a time when the president needs to seem like he's on strong footing as he faces a Democratic control House.
Well, and chiefs of staff have such critical roles. Historically, they're the quarterback for the president's agenda. They're the gatekeeper to the president in the West Wing. These are people that make sure that the staff is operating, functioning well in the West Wing. That's one of the reasons why John Kelly, the enforcer, was brought in
and they
to
often
some success.
liaise with Congress. And they try to get the president's agenda through on Capitol Hill.
They're the president's point man. So who are some of the people they're considering? Well, take a look at the list. ABC News is reporting the president is back to the drawing board on this one. A lot of names floating about right now. Seems to be changing by the hours, but Congressman Mark Meadows of North Carolina is there. Dave Bossie, the president's former deputy campaign chairman. Steve Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary. Matt Whitaker, he's the acting attorney general. His name is being thrown about. And of course, OMB Director Mick Mulvaney, who has sort of told us he's not interested. But want to go back to Mary Bruce quickly. Mary, it does seem like Mark Meadows, someone the president is particularly fond of. He sort of shares the president's disruptor spirit, if you will. He was the head of the Freedom Caucus that gave Paul Ryan so much trouble. What do you know about Mark Meadows, and what are you hearing up there about his interest?
Well, he certainly has shown in the past that he can work well with the president. There certainly would not be a steep learning curve. He's someone who knows Congress well. He knows how this building operates, and he would likely be able to work with many members of Congress, help the president and the White House sort of navigate Capitol Hill. He has reportedly said that it would be an honor to serve as chief of staff. That surprised some up here because it had seemed that Meadows previously may not be that interested in the position, but perhaps it seems he may be coming around. It would be interesting. Of course, he would represent. Clearly be a strong voice for the Freedom Caucus and that far right side of Capitol Hill within the White House. But he and the president have shown they work well together. He, of course, also is no stranger to the media. He often speaks with us. He presents well on television, something that we know sometimes the president appreciates in members of his staff. But he could be a good voice for Republicans, certainly the far right within this White House. And it does seem from what we're seeing that Mark Meadows may be coming around to the idea. Yeah,
certainly. If the fact that he's saying it would be an incredible honor. Somebody also who knows about oversight, House oversight, which as Democrats take over, might be a very useful skill and knowledge set to have as the president's going to get under fire. Before we move on, Mary Alice, I was sort of struck. We'd love to get your take on this. The president, there's a tweet for everything that the president says and does. And I was struck by this one. I remember this one from 2012 when President Trump was very critical of Barack Obama for blowing through chiefs of staff. 3 chiefs of staff in less than 3 years of being president. Part of the reason why Barack Obama can't manage to pass his agenda, that was Trump of 2012. Now here he is in the same boat.
Well, by comparison, actually, that would look a lot more stable than this White House in terms of turnover. But you're right. The president, in so many instances, has basically thrown caution to the wind, has decided to be his own chief of staff on occasion, his own press secretary on occasion. And you get the sense that that they're sort of still coming up with ideas about where the direction of this White House and this office should go.
And speaking of pressure from Capitol Hill on the White House in the new year, one of the words that was dropped over the weekend on the Sunday shows, which we haven't heard a lot of until recently, is the I word, impeachment. A number of Democrats out there on the cables yesterday dropped that word. They're thinking about it, particularly in light of Robert Mueller and the Southern District of New York sentencing memos from Friday, those bombshell reports. Here's what Senator Chris Murphy, Democrat of Connecticut, and Jerry Nadler, the Democrat of New York, had to say about this yesterday. Take a listen.
The president has now stepped into the same territory that ultimately led to President Nixon resigning the office. President Nixon was an unindicted co-conspirator, certainly a different set of facts. But this investigation is now starting to put the president in serious legal crosshairs. And he should be worried, and the whole country should be worried.
Certainly they'd be impeachable offenses because even though they were committed before the president became president, they were committed in the service of fraudulently obtaining the office. That would be that would be an impeachable offense.
So, Mary Bruce, what are you hearing up there today, one day after this weekend, really, of people absorbing the news? The president, basically an unindicted co-conspirator with Michael Cohen in the Stormy Daniels payment matter, the federal election laws being violated there. Is there serious talk about launching an impeachment probe just based on that crime?
I think what's important to point out is what the likely incoming chairman there, Nadler, said next, which is not only that this possibly could be an impeachable offense, but that does not necessarily mean that they would make the move here to impeach, because just because something they think rises to the level of being an impeachable offense doesn't necessarily mean that House members here will take that step. And that's an important distinction, because remember, Democratic leaders here for months have been saying that they're going to wait to decide on what to do when it comes to the I word based off of what comes from Mueller's report. They want to know what Robert Mueller has found before they make any decision there. But what is very clear is that in a couple of weeks, when House Democrats are in charge up here, they are going to do everything within their power to get to the bottom of this issue and so many others. And it certainly is clear also that even if members of Congress don't take the remarkable step of moving to impeach the president, that his legal woes are certainly far from over, based, of course, in particular on what those federal prosecutors in New York revealed last week, which is that the president directed his fixer, Michael Cohen, to pay hush money to these two women to keep them quiet about these alleged affairs. And that could mean that the president committed felonies. And that it puts the president not just in political, but certainly very big legal jeopardy as well.
And Mary Bruce on Capitol Hill, thank you so much for that reporting. Let's touch base with Jordan Phelps one more time back on this story as well. Jordan, the president, to pick up where Mary left off, has been pushing back on the suggestion that he was a co-conspirator in a crime, saying today on Twitter that those payments to Stormy Daniels, the same ones he said he didn't know anything about, were personal payments, and if there was any wrongdoing, it was simply a legal error on the part of Michael Cohen.
Yeah, and you love how the president points out there that even if it had happened, it wouldn't be a problem for him. That seems to be a caveat he adds in a lot of these situations these days. Look, the president has already been touting this line of presidential harassment. When we look ahead into January and the president going head-to-head with a democratically controlled Congress, expect the president to really beat that drum and make the case that Democrats coming after him on anything related to, these payments or Russia are distracting from the success of the country. And we didn't see him really hammer this line last week when we saw some skittishness in the markets, but the president has already said, and he said this on the campaign trail, that he would blame the Democrats, and it would be their fault, he said, if there are economic troubles ahead. So look to see the president really push back on everything, as he always does. He will be very combative. This is only going to get more intense as we look ahead to January, Devin.
I think that's a true statement. Jordan Phelps, thank you so much.
I mean, the president can say that it wouldn't have been a big issue, that they were private payments, but we now have federal prosecutors saying they think it was a very big deal, essentially accusing the president of trying to defraud voters, trying to be dishonest with voters in the lead up to the election.
And these were separate prosecutors from the Robert Mueller probe. These were entirely different set of people, not the 17 so-called angry Democrats that he's been bashing for the past few weeks. It's really interesting that it comes from a separate division of his own Justice Department.
Right, who are saying that we think this was a crime and we think it was a serious crime.
And they put their voice on it. Very interesting. And finally today, I was up at the Supreme Court this morning. Interesting decision, interesting move by the Supreme Court, declining today to take up two interesting cases involving Planned Parenthood and states' efforts, Louisiana and Kansas, to block federal money, Medicaid money, from those organizations in that state. Mary Alice, the court basically said, we're not going to hear these cases. We're going to let the lower court rulings stand. And what those rulings did is they said you have to allow Medicaid money to go to Planned Parenthood clinics unless there's some due process, due process given to the states and to the clinics. Really interesting because conservatives in those two states and elsewhere have been hammering Planned Parenthood, trying to come at them from backdoor ways to defund them, even though these cases didn't deal specifically with abortion.
Right. In a lot of ways, this is a big win for advocates for women's health, women's reproductive health, who've been saying, look, people get all kinds of services at Planned Parenthood clinics. They use Medicaid dollars to pay for cancer screenings and birth control, and it's not fair to single out these clinics, which in many states, especially in rural areas, are the only clinics that some women can attend. And it's not fair to go out sort of a roundabout way to gut these clinics and gut the government money that can go to them, and that really it should be up to patients to decide which clinics they go to. So a big win in these few cases in this day for those supporters of women's reproductive rights.
We should note that 3 of the conservative justices, just to button that up, did dissent in this matter today, opposed to the fact that the court didn't take the cases. Here's Justice Thomas writing for Alito and Gorsuch as well. These cases are not about abortion rights. They are about private rights of action under the Medicaid Act. In other words, he thinks that resolving the question presented here, that one being whether an individual can actually challenge the state's decision to block money, bit of a technicality, to Planned Parenthood, really should be considered by the court. It should be noted, Mary Alice, that Justice Kavanaugh, Justice Roberts, 2 of the other court's conservatives, actually agreed with the liberal justices today to say, let it alone, let it stand. Very interesting right out of the gate for Kavanaugh.
Especially because we're going to see a lot more cases dealing with these sorts of issues in the coming
they're in the pipeline.
months and years for sure. Yep.
Well, that's it for day 690 of the Trump administration, if you can believe it, here in the ABC News briefing room. Great to have you with us today. Follow the latest on all these stories, of course. Download the ABC News app if you don't have it. You can follow us at abcnews.com. Be sure to follow Mary Alice and Rick Klein's analysis and the notes each morning. You can find it there on the app. For Mary Alice, great to have you here. I'm Devin Dwyer, Washington. We'll see you tomorrow at 3:30 here in the briefing room.